Racist cops arrest a black woman, only to come face to face with her as the presiding judge in their own trial. But this trial isn't just about them. It exposes a shocking truth no one expected. The bustling downtown of Charlotte pulsed with the sounds of traffic and the hurried footsteps of pedestrians on the stone-paved sidewalks. Among the crowd, Officer Derek and Officer Brian strode with an air of authority, the kind that came not from respect, but from the belief that they controlled these streets. Their reputation had spread, not for solving cases with brilliance, but for stopping anyone they deemed suspicious. Locals whispered about them, yet few dared to speak out. Today, their eyes locked onto a woman who, by their standards, didn't belong here. Margaret Green, a middle-aged black woman with a composed demeanor, stepped out of a sleek black sedan parked near City Hall. Her navy blue suit was crisp, a neatly folded pocket square in place. Polished leather shoes reflected the city lights, and in her hand, she carried a well-worn leather briefcase, a testament to decades of dedication to her profession. Everything about her exuded confidence, the presence of someone with purpose and status. But to Derek and Brian, her immaculate appearance wasn't a mark of distinction, it was a warning sign. "Stop right there." Derek's voice rang out, sharp and laced with self-appointed authority. His hand drifted instinctively toward the gun at his hip, his gaze fixed, waiting for that all-too-familiar flicker of fear. Margaret halted, turning slowly. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, but only for a moment. Her expression remained composed as she spoke. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice was calm and unwavering, too steady, too controlled. It unsettled them. Brian stepped forward, feigning concern. "We received a report about a vehicle matching yours being involved in a recent robbery." A baseless accusation, conjured on the spot. But Margaret's unshaken confidence was enough to stoke their irritation. She raised an eyebrow, her tone unchanged. "That's a serious allegation. May I see the report?" Derek's jaw tightened, irritation flashing in his eyes. "Hands where I can see them. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice." His voice left no room for escape. Pedestrians froze. Curious, wary eyes turned toward them. Phones lifted, cameras rolling, capturing every second. Margaret didn't resist. She moved deliberately, methodically. The cuffs clamped around her wrists with a cold, unyielding finality. "You're making a grave mistake," she said, her voice steady, unshaken. Derek and Brian smirked. They had no idea they had just ignited a storm. Inside the holding cell at the precinct, Margaret Green sat. Composed, in the cramped, dimly lit space. Outside, the air buzzed with Derek and Brian's smug laughter, drunk on the power their badges afforded them. "Who does she think she is?" Derek scoffed, jerking his head toward Margaret. Brian folded his arms, smirking. "Probably thinks staying quiet makes her look innocent." Margaret didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence wasn't fear, it was a verdict, an unseen weight hanging over them, though they hadn't realized it yet. Each time she requested her phone call, they ignored her. Or worse, responded with smug taunts. They weren't interested in the truth, only in asserting control. But beyond the precinct's walls, a different narrative was unfolding. Videos of the arrest spread at lightning speed. Every second recorded on bystanders' phones became undeniable evidence. The fabricated charges, the heavy-handed treatment, and, most striking of all, Margaret's unshaken dignity. The internet erupted. Activists condemned the blatant racial profiling. News channels replayed the footage on a loop, dissecting every moment, questioning the true motives behind Derek and Brian's actions. Hashtags demanding justice flooded social media platforms. While the two officers laughed, drunk on their illusion of power, they remained oblivious to the storm brewing just beyond the precincts. Derek and Brian basked in their own sense of victory. To them, Margaret was just another routine arrest, another tally in their reports, another statistic to pad their records. The thought that they had apprehended someone important never even crossed their minds. Inside the holding cell, Margaret finally spoke, her voice calm yet sharp, slicing through the stillness as she addressed the sergeant on duty. "I need to contact my office. I have a court session tomorrow." The sergeant smirked, leaning lazily against the desk. A court session? You planning to represent yourself in front of a judge? Margaret's gaze remained steady, her words measured yet unyielding. No, I am the judge. The smirk froze on the sergeant's lips. Silence rippled through the room, broken only by the frantic clatter of a keyboard as he scrambled to verify her identity. And then the truth flashed on the screen. Margaret Green, Judge, Charlotte City Court. The sergeant's face paled. A ripple of shock swept through the precinct like a lit match meeting gasoline. A storm had been ignited, and this time, it would consume those who had set it in motion. The following morning, the courthouse bristled with tension. Reporters jostled. For the best vantage point, camera lenses trained on the entrance. Members of the community, the same people who had watched Margaret's wrongful arrest unfold on their screens, filled the courtroom's gallery, their faces a mix of outrage and anticipation. The clock ticked toward the critical hour. And then, the doors swung open. Margaret Green entered, draped in the solemn black robes of her office. She moved with deliberate confidence, each step carrying the weight of authority. No longer the woman in handcuffs from the day before. Today, she stood at the highest seat in the courtroom. The seat from which her power was unquestionable. She swept her gaze across the room, eyes lingering on the two men who had humiliated her. Derek and Brian entered moments later, their postures stiff, their bravado evaporated. Gone was the arrogance. They carried only unease, a cold sweat forming at their temples as they avoided the piercing stares around them. Margaret's voice rang out, steady and unshakable. Officers Derek and Brian, you are charged with racial profiling, unlawful arrest, and abuse of authority. Do you have anything to say in your defense? The officers stammered, their voices faltering. Feeble justifications of procedure and reasonable suspicion crumbled under the weight of evidence. The courtroom screens lit up with the footage, Margaret, composed and dignified, juxtaposed against their aggressive, unwarranted actions. Witnesses recounted the baseless accusations, the excessive force. And then came the irrefutable truth, Margaret's record, a judge who had spent years fighting for justice and community reform. She presided over the trial with unwavering professionalism, yet the fire in her eyes remained. The irony of it all was undeniable. The very officers who had arrested her on her way to meet with the mayor about community reform had now become the most damning proof of the very injustices she sought to dismantle. The trial concluded swiftly, the verdict delivered without hesitation. Derek and Brian were suspended without pay, pending further investigation. Their reckless bias was no longer a quiet matter within the police force. It had become the outrage of an entire community. Under immense public pressure, the police chief was forced to hold a press conference. His face was taut with strain as he issued a formal apology, acknowledging that the department had not only failed Margaret Green but had also betrayed the trust of the people of Charlotte. Yet no words of regret could salvage their reputation. They had become the embodiment of systemic injustice. For Margaret, this was more than just a personal ordeal, it was a pivotal moment for the community she had dedicated her life to serving. But rather than dwell in resentment, she chose to act. Leveraging her position as a judge and the overwhelming support from the public, Margaret spearheaded a campaign to reform the police department. She worked tirelessly alongside city officials to implement mandatory training programs aimed at dismantling racial bias, fostering stronger ties between law enforcement and the community, and restoring the trust that had been so recklessly shattered. The story of Margaret Green, a judge wrongfully arrested by the very system she represented, became a rallying cry. Protests for justice surged across the city, drawing people of all backgrounds, united by a shared demand for change. But the impact did not stop at Charlotte. Public pressure forced the state government to enact sweeping reforms, greater police accountability, independent oversight commissions to investigate misconduct, and systemic changes to ensure no officer could wield their badge as a weapon of prejudice again. What began as an unjust arrest became the catalyst for transformation. And Margaret Green had turned pain into action, injustice into a driving force for reform. Months later, as the storm of public outcry slowly settled, Margaret Greene stood on the steps of City Hall, allowing herself a rare moment of reflection. Below her, a new class of police recruits lined up, stepping forward into the academy one by one. Their faces were young, diverse, chosen under new standards, not just for skill, but for integrity and a commitment to fairness. Their eyes burned with determination, with hope, a promise of a new era in law enforcement, where justice was upheld with dignity and respect, not wielded through fear and prejudice. Margaret allowed herself a faint smile, measured, cautious, yet genuine. The scars of injustice had not faded, and the memory of being handcuffed in the middle of the street still lingered in her mind. But today, standing here, she allowed herself to believe that change was possible. One day, she thought, justice would no longer be a battle fought in the dark. It would be a given, a foundation so unshakable that society could stand upon it, unwavering and absolutely fair. But today, she would keep walking her path, not with the illusion that the fight was over, but with the certainty that every step, no matter how small, was worth taking. Margaret Greene's story was not just about a woman standing up against injustice. It was a reminder that justice does not exist on its own. It must be fought for, protected, and nurtured every single day. Officers like Derek and Brian were not the first to abuse their power, and their story was not an anomaly. How many others lived in fear, wondering if they would be the next Margaret Greene, misjudged, mistreated, stripped of their rights simply because they did not fit into the mold that society had imposed? But if one person could stand up and force change upon an entire system, how many more could do the same? Stories of injustice are not rare. Sometimes, the truth is so unsettling that we choose to look away. But what happens when one day, you find yourself in that very situation? When the system that was built to protect you turns its back, reducing you to nothing more than a statistic? Margaret Greene's story had come to an end, but the fight had not. The same mistakes, the same biases, the same endless cycles of injustice continued, quietly ensnaring those who never saw it coming. Imagine this: one wrong assumption, one suspicious glance, one baseless accusation, that may be all it takes to turn an innocent person into a victim of a broken system. And the question remains, when that day comes, will you be able to protect yourself? Don't miss the stories that follow, real events, silent tragedies, moments where fate is decided in mere seconds. Stay with us, because what you're about to uncover will make you question everything you thought you knew. Thank you for taking the time to follow this story. Stay safe, stay strong, and continue this journey with us as we explore more stories that matter. Disclaimer: this content has been compiled and rewritten with AI assistance and does not represent any specific individual or organization. Any resemblance to real events or persons is purely coincidental.